morning. I have to apologize that the story you'll hear now, it's not a cheering one, so it will probably, not make you happy for the rest of the day. But I always say, if you don't like the weather, don't shoot the weatherman. I'm trying to give you an accurate forecast. So looking at the big picture and just, learning something from the past, and trying to, to analyze what's happening in the present, to lay down the recommendations for the future. Actually, for me, it's quite a refreshing experience because since I retired in 2005 from professional chess, I did a few things, including, doing lectures and the one on strategy and decision making you will hear later on this afternoon. And it was quite often that in this period, the organizers specifically asked me, some of them were more prudent, to put it in the contract, not to mention Russia and Vladimir Putin. It's like Voldemort, which made me feel like Harry Potter. Especially because in Russian language, my name Garry, so there's no difference between G and H. So now things have changed, and it's something that I believe was, could be easily predicted if we look back, at the history timeline, read the books, and simply to realize that while history maybe is not as precise in science as mathematics or physics, and you cannot say it's 2 + 2 always equals 4, but it's close. And if you just follow the patterns, certain patterns from the past, you can easily apply them to the modernity, to the period that we live, and try to understand the characters and the moves of world players. Just going back a little bit to 2005, when, as you heard now from the presenter, I retired from professional chess, and some people mistakenly thought that I moved into Russian politics. I wouldn't call it exactly politics, because in Russia, as I said, we were not trying to win elections, we were trying to have elections. Yeah, and I will. And when people ask me whether my chess experience could help me in navigating in these rough waters again they said Russian politics, I said, look, I wish I could apply my chess experience. The difference is that in chess we have fixed rules and unpredictable results. In Russia it's exactly the opposite. But I looked at this as as a moral imperative. You may call it a moral challenge. I used to play for a good part of my life a game, professional game, where it was all about winning or losing. I knew that it was not exactly the same in Russia, because I was realistic enough to recognize the shortcomings of the opposition and chances of winning, but it was more about making your statement. So making sure that, one day I can tell my kids that I did what I could, but also making investment for the future, because, one person cannot change everything, but you can show show the way to others. And what I believe was vital, very important for Russia, is to make sure that the transition will not be a violent one. They will get rid of the traditional brutalities from Russian history, and that's why I've been promoting the idea of highly unusual for Russia, non-violent resistance. And I just thought that today, since it's October 2nd, so it was nice to look at the Wikipedia, and I believe that it's very relevant to remember the person who actually started this concept. And it's a very important phrase, but a good person will resist an evil system with his whole soul. Disobedience of the laws of an evil state is therefore a duty. And I've been doing my utmost of promoting these ideas in Russia, and I believe that we achieved something big because the message was heard, and we had rallies, we brought enough people into the movement, but it was not enough. And I'll try to explain why why we failed at this historical moment, and while Putin is still in power, and what could be done to make sure that the damage that will be caused by this brutal dictatorship will not exceed the worst expectations. Just going back a little bit, just to what I said in the beginning, it's always nice to have the sort of the visual proof of that. And I just have a little slide to show you how the typical Russian polling stations looked and looks now. You have a choice, of course, as you could see. You can vote. You remember the name Medvedev? Somebody has a good memory to remember the shadow of Vladimir Putin that was sitting there for 4 years, making sure that Putin can consolidate power, come back. And the other things I put in here is just to if you want to analyze, the nature of Putin's regime, you don't have to read political articles. You have to read Godfather, because it's the Godfather. Yes, Mario Puzo. That's the book. Yes, it's the way the system in Russia works, as probably most of dictatorships work. It's very different from democracy, monarchy, or even some kind of ideological systems, because it's all about loyalty to the boss. So there's a difference between Vladimir Putin's Russia and, let's say, the communist China. Because Chinese regime is the communist ideology, but you have a Politburo, you have the Central Committee. It's a fairly stable system, which has, inevitably has a balance of interests. When you have dozens of people or hundreds of people making decisions, even if they're really bad people, they'll still try to find a common ground. That's natural. The most dangerous, unstable, unpredictable system is a one-man dictatorship. And that's Vladimir Putin's Russia. That's mafia-like system. No crimes are punished except the loss of loyalty to the boss. So to the top boss, and then you just go down to the system. So the system which is based on loyalty, it's naturally, could be compared to a mafia system. And there are a couple of pictures about the way they treat the protesters. So it's 2000, I don't remember which one. I think it's 2012. I was arrested a few times, so that's 2012. Yeah, now, another question I just raised a couple of minutes ago, it's why the regime was so stable. It's 15 years. Putin is there, and many believe he will stay there for a very long time. I don't know. So what I can tell you, I can bet my bottom dollar that he will die in Kremlin. When and how and from what cause remains to be seen. The bad news, I don't know it. The good thing, he also doesn't know it. But again, you read history books, that's what happens with dictators. Or you can just watch, the relatively recent reports from Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, and other countries. Now, Vladimir Putin regime's stability was based on very savvy politics, both domestically and foreign one, recognizing that to stay in power and to consolidate power, Putin needed friends. And he did it extremely well. I mean, it's a KGB school at the end of the day. That's a very good friend. I would say probably business partner. Yeah, this is a recent picture. But by the way, it also shows the weakness, It's Obama is trying to shake his hand. And don't underestimate the tiny details, because dictators, they pay a lot of attention. This is the way they survive. A good, savvy dictator, knows that the body language, the way he looks, the way he presents himself to the oppressed, it's absolutely vital. And that's of course, all the picture. That's when Putin was hosting one of these meetings and of so-called, I can't pronounce G8. I always said G7+1. Yeah, eventually was kicked out from this organization as he deserved. Now, it's very difficult for somebody who was not born and raised in the communist or any totalitarian country to understand the relevance of such a picture. These pictures were presented on Russian television, and it was a clear message to, I'm not talking about people from the countryside, even to the Russian middle class, people who might have sympathy to Garry Kasparov, to Boris Nemtsov, to other leaders of the opposition, but they could see the picture, and what this picture told them? That Vladimir Putin is one of the world democratic leaders. He's a member of this family. He's there. So who they should believe? Blair, Chirac, Berlusconi, Bush, you name them, Merkel there. So, or good guys, but they are here and maybe they have their own agenda. So Putin's regime was quite smart in using the gains on the international arena to strengthen the rule inside the country, because it was virtually impossible to communicate to the chunk of Russian population that we were trying to address that Putin's regime was non-democratic, that democracy in Russia was buried alive, and elections were rigged, and Putin was, would inevitably become a dictator. They looked at these pictures and they believed otherwise. I don't understand. This is the. It was a natural reaction because nobody wanted to hear bad news. That's often happens in the era of virtual reality. Just we want to hear the story that makes us feel happy. That's why I apologized this morning, just before starting my speech. And certain facts that do not fit this picture, we try to sort of. It's like a deflection. We don't want to look at them. And I also have to confess that after the end of the Cold War, collapse of the Soviet Union, we all had big expectations. And many of you remember the best-selling book of Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, 1992. Again, it was a reflection of our big expectations. It's over, and the past will never come back. I think anybody could make billions in bets in August 1991 if he or she could predict that less than 9 years later, a KGB lieutenant colonel would become a president of Russia. So in August 91, impossible to imagine. But it's happened, and what we're seeing today is actually the natural development or natural progress. I'm not sure what progress is the correct one, of Putin's dictatorship, as it happened with other dictators. He needed friends in the beginning. Today, the same propaganda machine that promoted these images needs enemies. Because at one point, dictator runs out of arguments why he's staying in power for so long. As you know, if you're following any press reports, economy in Russia is no longer offering an excuse. So if 10 years ago, Putin's regime could tell to Russian citizens, forget democracy, forget human rights, you have, certain kind of prosperity, steady improvement of living standards. Today, everything is in the decline. So Russia cannot boast of any economic progress, and moreover, people who can think, they realize that everything will be getting even worse. So the only argument is a story that Russia is the besieged fortress of good surrounded by enemies. That's not unusual if you, again, read his history books. And Vladimir Putin is the only person who would protect Mother Russia against all these enemies, which he is, by the way, the greatest expert of creating. It's quite amazing just to think that in 2015, Russia is fighting either open wars or having any form of confrontation with most of the former Soviet republics and independent states west of Moscow. But that's a fact. And 2 years ago, anybody could bet, of Russian troops invading Ukraine. But it did happen, and somehow it was again so logical development, because Putin needed arguments, and dictator, always looks abroad when he run out of enemies inside the country. Opposition is destroyed in Russia, so new enemies could be found elsewhere. So Ukraine, Estonia, Republic of Georgia, you name it. So definitely there's quite a long list. Yeah, and when we're trying to find, the rational strategy of dealing with Putin, we hear time and again, no, it's too tough. He's too strong. He's too dangerous. Maybe we can find a way of making an arrangement. Okay, I'm not even telling you that in 1948, for instance, the West, led by Harry Truman, had to face Joseph Stalin. And don't tell me that Joseph Stalin in 48 was less dangerous than Vladimir Putin today, and less powerful. So just, don't make me laugh. But it's then the next argument is that, it's economically, it's too difficult because Russia supplies gas to Europe, Russia does that and that. It's too vital for us to keep relations. Look at this chart and tell me who has the leverage. You know, Putin's Russia depends on Western customers 3 times more than they depend on Putin. Of course, you know, it will not be pleasant, so it may lead to some, you know, difficulties, but it will blow up Russian economy. So Putin can't cut all the ties. And it's when I hear these outcries from Germany or other places, you know, I'm always confused because those are hard facts. This is the statistics. And of course, you know, Putin, you know, benefits from these signs of weakness, and you could see this as how propaganda machine works. Russia today, it's probably the best financed TV stations in the world. Its budget is 3 times more than Al Jazeera. And it keeps going up despite the fact that Putin cuts all the expenses. By the way, when you look at Russian budget, you know, the projections, they cut everything except military, police, and propaganda. Again, they know what is important, you know, to stay in power. Again, I don't want to go into all details, but we hear almost on a weekly, if not on a daily basis, you know, outcries that we have to, you know, cut the sanctions, go back to the normal relations. You know, God forbid, you know, is this, you know, weakness always provokes further aggression. And the way Putin sees the world, you know, is based on his assessment, whether he could be met with strong response, he would be repulsed, or he can get an extra space, you know, vacated by politics, by military, or by business elements of the free world. Just to make sure that, you know, we sum up this the concept of appeasement, and I don't want to talk about the 30s, though the parallels are quite telling. And when people criticize me or others for even mentioning name Hitler, so I'm always telling them that, you know, you should remember that in 1935, 1936, 1937, 1938, Hitler was not a Hitler from history books. It was a leader of Germany, mildly criticized, but by the way, highly respected by the Western press. You don't trust me? Read London Times, New York Times, Toronto Star, Le Monde. It's how we build dictators by our weaknesses and by appeasements, and that's what I try to summarize. So the hard lessons of appeasement. So engagement is only liberalizes if the regime wants to liberalize. It's like, you know, the Gorbachev saw no choice from internal pressure to open up Soviet Union, for instance. So autocracies export corruption instead of becoming more transparent. So if you have relations, you know, without any, you know, proper due diligence, it's not that your high standards will apply into the corrupt economy, but other way around. They will be corrupting your executives, and I don't have to tell you, you know, just there's too many cases now, you know, known and being investigated. Democratic leaders treating dictators like equals make internal dissent much more difficult. That's what I said. You know, it's every time, you know, the democratic leaders provide new credentials for a dictator, it makes more difficult, not only for dissent in the street, not only for the opposition in the street, but also for potentially dissenting elements within the elite. Because they could see that the leader, the Führer, whatever the name is, so is invincible. He wins time and again the battle against the weak Western democracies. Now, and then we could see that it's, you know, the regimes like Putin's, they don't stay within the borders, they move outside. And now I'll try to connect these dots and just to show the big picture, because everybody's talking about Russia being an ally in the war against terror. Okay, if you follow the news, you could see that the first bombings, the first attack by Russian military jets in Syria was not against ISIS, but against American-backed rebels against Assad. And Putin's activities in Syria, they have nothing to do with the war on terror, because at the end of the day, it's when you look at this big picture, you can realize that they are somehow all connected. Look at these pictures, they're quite similar. So you have ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, and Russian-backed terrorists in Ukraine. They look similar, and it's not only because they're wearing masks, but because they are connected spiritually. For them, the value of human life is irrelevant. So killing thousands, or if some can do hundreds of thousands of millions, it's just statistics and just to prove their strengths. And relying on Vladimir Putin just to fight these guys that are, as I said, connected spiritually, it's a terrible mistake. And this is something that I wanted to present, because I think this is very it's a very important, in my view, it's a very important concept to analyze. I call it modernity versus time travelers. Now, I would call them time travelers, because when you look at the global map, political map, whether it's 21st century, 20th century, 19th century, so we always had different political regimes, different systems that could exist, not peacefully, but separately in different parts of the world. So in the 20th century, say 50 years ago, there were many regimes that were not up to our standards, but we did not interact with them. What's happened with globalization, with all these new devices that could tell us what's happening in Indonesia, in Japan, in Rwanda within a split of a second, that the world has shrunk. And it's not just we know what's happening there, but they also know what's happening here. And it becomes impossible for these kind of regimes, to exist in this vacuum. They have to prove to their subjects, to their oppressed, why they are ruling them in such a brutal and cruel way. And the only rationale is to prove that they're fighting for certain values. And these values are very different from ours. So some of the regimes, like Putin's regimes, they live in the 19th century. They believe that controlling big territories is important for the greatness. Some of them, like, we may look for, say, Al-Qaeda-like organizations. They live in the medieval time. Some of them, like ISIS, they even just promoting the early version of Islam, where beheading and slavery were norms. So that's 7th or 8th century. Again, if we didn't have this, an ability to communicate and to travel as extensively as now, we could probably expect these things to, stay far away from us. The problem is, if everything travels, if money travels, labor travels, information travels, so the terrorism. And I don't even want to blame them for doing that, because these creatures cannot survive otherwise. As I said, the only competitive advantage of these regimes against us, against the free world, is the value of human life. They cannot compete on innovations, they cannot compete on ideas, they cannot compete on, on improving living standards, but they know that they can compete in wars, in terror, in intimidation, because they don't care if people die. We do. For us, one body bag is already a national disaster. For them, 1 million is not just statistics, but it's a proof of their strengths that they will project to those who are following them. So we just have to realize that it's there, and we can't avoid it. So they will be interfering with our lives, even if we try to to build walls and pretend that we're not we don't want to hear about them. So the waves of refugees from Syria that is flooding now Europe is not an accident. If you want to look at the sequel of the events, I can give you one. So in 2008, did you hear about refugees in 2008? Was a war, was ISIS in 2008? And it's not that I'm trying to justify the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. But as a professional chess player, I know that if you do something, and it's not a good move, it doesn't mean that you can go back. if you create a certain situation on the board, I mean, you have to play by, by the facts that you are dealing with right now. So to remove all American troops from Iraq without having any game plan for the future was a much bigger mistake. Because you remove the troops, you basically betray the Sunnis in Iraq, who made a deal with the American administration and who helped to expel Al-Qaeda. And okay, Sunni Shia, I guess you understand this, it's like Catholic and Protestants in Europe 500 years ago. So now you have the government in Baghdad, which is under total Iranian control now. It's a Shia government. So Sunnis in Iraq, they feel betrayed. They have to look for elsewhere. Then you have the same situation across the border with Sunnis in Syria, who have been betrayed by America because after the infamous Red Line, when Assad used chemicals, they realized America would not protect them. So for them, and it's hard to imagine, ISIS looked like liberators, those who defended them against potential extermination by enemies, and they have different ideas of enemies. And people who are running now out from that region, most of them running from Assad, from Bashar al-Assad. And when I hear today some European leaders saying that, oh, we can't solve the problem in Syria without Russia, I think they just, they're suffering from the lack of logic. Russia is not a mediator, Russia is a part of this conflict. And Putin has a clear idea how to deal with that. So I just try to now make a big picture. So this is let's give it a map. Because he wins on every count. He protects Assad, and that's a clear message to every dictator in the world. Actually, not only dictator, that Vladimir Putin will back his friends. Barack Obama betrays everybody. Vladimir Putin defends his guys. Very important for a dictator. He's strong. It goes back to Russia. I mean, maybe some of you, read Russian. So Russian press trumpeted big victory for Vladimir Putin in New York. He came to New York to the den of the beast. He told Obama that he would do it, and he went on doing that. As I said, it was irrelevant what Obama said in the United Nations because he knew he would not act. It was also irrelevant what Vladimir Putin said in the United Nations because he knew he would act anyway, as he did. Next day, Russian planes bombed, and again, not ISIS, but American-backed rebels in Syria. So Putin defends Assad. Putin helps Iran. Putin, demonstrates that he can defy any rules. And nobody talks about Crimea anymore. Nobody talks about Ukraine. So everybody looks at Syria now, and suddenly Putin, who was a pariah just a month ago, now he's a savior. And of course, he creates a mess, which is very important in the Middle East. Let's not forget, Russian economy still depends on oil. And oil prices are ridiculously low by Putin's opinion. He can't influence it through the economy. How to influence it? Create a major war in the Middle East. And he's pushing in this direction. It will not take long for Saudis to start supporting Sunnis in the region. And then you have jihadists from Taliban, from Pakistan, you name it, just jumping into this fight, which means, the whole region will explode. And of course, millions of refugees in Europe, it's an extra benefit for Putin. Europe is getting weaker, Europe is in turmoil, so weak, divided Europe cannot stand Russian aggression in Ukraine, and God knows whether he will decide to look elsewhere. That's probably not as north as Finland, but they're neighbors. Your neighbors that could be definitely vulnerable to the potential Russian attacks. So I put this little map to tell you this about big picture, and that's my new book. I said, it's you can look at the window. Winter is coming. Yes, definitely. And it was my attempt to analyze the results of the last 25 years and to answer these questions that I briefly touched in this presentation. And what I'm saying, it's not just tribute to the Game of Thrones, though I'm a big fan. But it's also my take on world history. It is not linear, it goes in seasons. And now we're entering this cold season, whether we like it or not. But the way to fight the weather, it's not, it's to make ourselves ready. So to buy warm clothes and just to have solid constructions, with good heating system. So we will pass this period, but it's very important that we'll be ready and will not be in a state of denial of the obvious facts. So I've been saying for a long time that Vladimir Putin's Russia would be a threat not only for us inside Russia, not only for bordering states, but for the rest of the world. Unfortunately, that's happening now. And I can say that, even if we talk about time travelers, we understand that we cannot fix things that already happened. We do have time travelers, but we do not have time machines. So we cannot go back to stop North Korea from developing a nuclear weapon. We cannot go back to stop Putin from invading Ukraine. We cannot go back and save the hundreds and thousands of people murdered by Assad and protect the millions of refugees he created. But if we learn from lessons of history, if we realize that every day of delay basically pushes the price up, because dictators do not disappear on their own. They could only, get stronger and more arrogant and emboldened by our weakness and our indecisiveness. And we realize we have no choice but to act. Then we need to act to prevent the next nuclear crisis, save the next hundreds of thousands of people, prevent next aggression, and protect the next million. Thank you.